Right now, in the Strait of Hormuz, ships are simply not moving. Not damaged, not sunk, just sitting there, engines idling, captains and shipping companies looking at the risk and deciding it isn't worth it. An industry analyst covering the region put it in 6 words. Nobody is willing to move. That's the actual headline of this update, more than any single missile strike. A 35-mile wide waterway that carries roughly a sixth of the world's oil has effectively frozen, and it happened without a single tanker being sunk to cause it. I want to walk you through exactly how we got to that point, what's confirmed, what's disputed, and what a decade plus of history with this exact waterway tells us about where threats like this usually go. Every claim in this video is attributed to where it came from. CENTCOM, CBS News, CNN, ABC News, AFP, Iran's IRNA news agency, and Reuters all show up in this one. And I'll tell you clearly which of them is saying what, because that's the only way. A story this contested actually earns your trust instead of just your attention. As of last night, U.S. forces completed a 7th consecutive night of strikes against Iran. CENTCOM confirmed the strikes concluded at 9:30 p.m. And a CENTCOM spokesman, Captain Tim Hawkins, made the U.S. military's position explicit in a public statement. The U.S. military never targets civilians, in his words, unlike Iran, which he said has repeatedly attacked innocent mariners transiting the strait and civilians in neighboring Gulf countries. I want to flag that as exactly what it is, an official U.S. military spokesman's characterization of the war, not a neutral third-party finding. CENTCOM has separately acknowledged that U.S. forces have struck facilities Iran describes as civilian in nature, while CENTCOM maintains those same facilities are being used by Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps to target shipping. That distinction, one side calling a site civilian, the other calling the same site a military target in disguise, is one of the central disputes running underneath almost every strike in this war. And it's worth remembering every time you see a claim about what got hit and why. The specific target from Thursday night is worth detailing, because it's a clean example of exactly the kind of infrastructure this stretch of the war has focused on. U.S. forces destroyed a port surveillance tower at Chabahar's Shahid Kalantari port, on Iran's Gulf of Oman coastline, east of the strait itself. CENTCOM's own statement said the tower had been used for decades by the Revolutionary Guard to track and target commercial vessels moving through the strait, and that destroying it directly degrades the Guard's ability to coordinate attacks on civilian crew members. That's a strike aimed squarely at Iran's ability to see, not just Iran's ability to shoot. Take out the eyes watching the strait, and every missile battery downstream of that surveillance network becomes less effective, even if the missiles themselves are untouched. It's worth understanding why a single tower gets this much attention in a war that's otherwise been about missiles, drones, and naval vessels. Maritime surveillance towers like this one are a low-cost, high-value piece of military infrastructure precisely because they don't need to be sophisticated to be effective. A position with a clear line of sight over a narrow, heavily trafficked shipping lane, paired with basic radar or optical tracking equipment and a communications link back to a targeting cell, can feed target data to missile batteries positioned miles away. That's part of why CENTCOM chose to publicize this specific strike with as much detail as it did, rather than folding it quietly into a general strike summary the way it does with many individual targets. A surveillance tower, unlike a bunker or a missile depot, has a straightforward, easy-to-explain function that translates cleanly into a public justification. This specific structure watched ships, so removing it protects ships. Chabahar itself sits on the eastern side of the strait's approach, along Iran's Gulf of Oman coast rather than directly on the narrower Persian Gulf side, which tells you the surveillance network Iran has built to monitor that waterway extends beyond the strait's immediate choke point and reaches into the wider approach lanes ships use well before they ever get close to the narrowest part of the passage. Here's what I think is the most underreported part of this entire stretch of the war. Even with strikes concentrated on military surveillance and command infrastructure rather than shipping lanes directly, global shipping has essentially self-imposed its own blockade out of pure risk aversion. 140 days into this war, with the exchange of attacks now grinding into its second week of near-nightly strikes, an industry analyst covering the region described the situation in the Strait of Hormuz plainly. Nobody is willing to move. That's a distinct, and in some ways, more consequential story than any individual strike. A government-imposed blockade is a decision that can, in principle, be negotiated, lifted, or worked around through escorted convoys. A shipping industry that's independently decided the risk isn't worth it is a much harder thing to reverse, because it isn't one government's policy you're negotiating with. It's the collective, decentralized judgment of insurers, ship owners, and captains all over the world, each individually deciding that today isn't the day to risk a multi-hundred-million-dollar vessel and a crew's lives in that specific stretch of water. Reuters has covered war risk insurance markets reacting to exactly this kind of sustained uncertainty in past conflicts. And the pattern tends to hold here too. Premiums spike. Some insurers simply stop offering coverage for that route at any price, and shipping companies reroute or wait rather than pay it. Think about the mechanics of what that actually means for a single ship captain. Before this war, transiting the strait was a routine, almost boring part of the job. You followed the shipping lane, kept your transponder on, and moved through in a matter of hours. Now, every captain making that call has to weigh a genuinely difficult set of unknowns. Is tonight one of the nights strikes are happening nearby? Is my vessel's flag or cargo the kind that's been targeted before? Does my insurer's war risk policy even cover me if something goes wrong in these specific waters right now? And critically, does my crew, likely made up of nationals from half a dozen different countries who never signed up to sail through an active war zone, actually want to make this transit tonight? Multiply that individual calculation across the hundreds of vessels that would normally move through the strait in a given week, and you get exactly the kind of mass, decentralized hesitation that's produced this standstill, not because anyone issued an order to stop, but because thousands of individual, rational risk assessments all landed on the same answer at roughly the same time. The knock-on effects of that kind of paralysis extend well beyond oil specifically, too. The strait doesn't just carry crude. It's a transit route for liquefied natural gas shipments, refined petroleum products, and general cargo moving between the Gulf and the rest of the world. A prolonged freeze doesn't just spike the price of gasoline eventually, it disrupts supply chains for products that have nothing directly to do with oil at all, in the same way a blocked major highway backs up traffic on streets miles away that were never part of the original route. Behind that shipping paralysis sits the U.S. naval blockade, which was reimposed after the Memorandum of Understanding-based ceasefire collapsed in under 3 weeks, specifically over disagreements about how traffic through the strait should be managed. That blockade is intended to fully halt Iranian oil and gas sales, and this week the U.S. military confirmed, according to CBS News, that it had redirected the first ship caught under the reimposed measures. Here's where the story gets genuinely more complicated than a simple blockade working as intended narrative. An Iranian oil industry spokesman, quoted through Iran's IRNA news agency, said that exports during the brief ceasefire window had actually helped Iran by clearing out storage facilities that had built up excess oil, allowing production to resume and preventing what he described as long-term damage to Iran's oil reservoirs from having nowhere to put what they were pumping. In other words, according to Iran's own account, the brief period of reduced restrictions during the ceasefire didn't just help Iran's export revenue. It may have solved an internal storage and production problem that had been building up during the earlier, tighter blockade period. That's a genuinely counterintuitive wrinkle we're sitting with. A pressure campaign paused just long enough to inadvertently give the target relief from a completely separate problem it was creating for itself. I can't independently verify Iran's own account of its storage capacity, and neither can most outlets covering this from outside the country, but it's a claim worth knowing about rather than ignoring just because it complicates a simpler story. I want to spend real time on something from the last day of reporting that's a genuinely useful case study in how to handle disputed claims responsibly, because it's happening in real time as I put this together. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed it had carried out what it called a surprise attack on a U.S. Special Forces base at Al-Tanf in southeastern Syria, saying it destroyed helicopters and caused casualties, framed as retaliation for U.S. strikes. That's a serious claim. An attack on an American base with casualties would be a significant escalation. Here's what happened next. A Syrian military source told AFP directly that Iran had not, in fact, struck a military base in that part of the country. That's a direct, on-the-record contradiction of the IRGC's own claim from a source inside the country where the attack was supposedly carried out. As of this recording, that claim remains unresolved in the sense that neither the U.S. military nor an independent investigation has issued a final, conclusive statement. But I want you to notice what just happened in real time. One side made a dramatic claim, and within roughly a day, a source with direct on-the-ground knowledge pushed back on it publicly. That's exactly the kind of check and verify process that responsible coverage of this war requires constantly, and it's exactly why I don't take any single claim, from any single side, as confirmed fact the moment it's made, including claims that would make for a more dramatic 30 seconds of footage if I just repeated them uncritically. I think it's worth explaining why a claim like this even gets made if it isn't true, because that helps you read future claims more critically too. In an active, multi-front war, unverified claims of successful strikes serve a purpose regardless of whether they're accurate. They shape domestic morale, they signal capability and reach to adversaries and allies alike, and they can pressure an opponent into diverting resources to investigate or defend against a threat that may not be real. That's not unique to Iran. It's a pattern that shows up from every combatant in nearly every modern conflict. which is exactly why a single military statement from any side, including the United States, shouldn't be treated as automatically true just because it was said with confidence. The Entente claim is a useful, low-stakes example of this dynamic precisely because it got checked quickly and publicly by a source with direct local knowledge, rather than lingering unchallenged for weeks, the way some disputed claims in this war have. Away from the surveillance and shipping story, the retaliatory side of this war continued hitting Gulf states hosting American infrastructure. Kuwait's military said Friday that several members of its ground forces were wounded and that military and civilian facilities were damaged in what it described as an Iranian attack involving both ballistic missiles and drones. That's a directly confirmed statement from Kuwait's own military, not a claim relayed secondhand through either combatant, and it continues a pattern that's held steady through nearly every night of this specific escalation. Gulf host nations, absorbing real casualties and real infrastructure damage for a war being fought primarily between two other countries. I want to give real weight to two specific statements from Iranian officials this week, because they tell you more about Tehran's actual posture than any strike count does on its own. Brigadier General Sayed Majid Mousavi said Friday that every inch of territory is equally important, and that Iran's strikes against what he called the enemy would continue until security and calm are restored along the southern coastline and in the Strait of Hormuz. That's a statement of resolve, not negotiation. It frames Iran's retaliatory strikes as continuing indefinitely until a condition of Iran's own choosing is met, with no timeline attached. Separately, and more significantly, an IRGC general said publicly that the U.S. had destroyed the Memorandum of Understanding, and that Iran would enter what he called an offensive phase if America continues the war. I want to be precise about what that phrase likely signals, because offensive phase is a meaningfully different posture than the retaliatory strikes Iran has been conducting for months now. Everything Iran has done since this war reignited in July has been framed, publicly, as a response to specific American strikes. Retaliation, proportionate or not, tied directly to something the U.S. did first. A declared shift to an offensive phase suggests Iran may be signaling a move away from that reactive posture towards something more independently initiated. Whether that's really what follows, or whether it's primarily rhetoric aimed at shoring up domestic resolve and pressuring the U.S. back toward the negotiating table, isn't something I can tell you with confidence right now, but it's a phrase worth remembering and watching for, because if Iran's actual operational behavior shifts to match that language, that would be a genuine and significant change in how this war has been fought so far. I mentioned a moment ago that I try to name the pieces of good news buried in an otherwise grim war, and there's one this week worth including. Trump announced that Iran had released an American woman wrongfully detained in the country since December of 2024, who is now safely outside Iran and reported to be in good condition. Her attorney separately confirmed she's now safe and traveling back to the United States, after being held under what he described as an exit ban, barred from leaving the country, though not imprisoned, over allegations connected to espionage and collaboration with a hostile state that her legal team has called baseless. Whatever else is true about the state of this war this week, that's a real family getting a phone call they've been waiting well over a year to receive. And I think it deserves to be named alongside everything else in this update, not buried underneath it. It's also worth noting the timing of that release relative to everything else happening this week, because it's another example of how this war keeps running pressure and diplomacy on parallel tracks rather than one clearly following the other. The release happened in the same general window as the seventh consecutive night of strikes, the Chabahar tower strike, and Iran's own offensive phase rhetoric, meaning Tehran chose to extend what Trump publicly called a gesture of goodwill at almost the exact moment it was also escalating its declared posture toward the war itself. That's not necessarily a contradiction on Iran's part any more than it's a contradiction for Trump to threaten more strikes while saying a deal is still possible. Governments in prolonged conflicts frequently maintain several tracks of engagement simultaneously, using different channels for different purposes, and reading any single track in isolation tends to give you an incomplete picture of what's actually happening. I think it's genuinely useful, and honestly reassuring in a specific way, to understand that threats to close or disrupt the Strait of Hormuz didn't start with this war. This exact waterway has been a recurring flashpoint between Iran and the United States for well over a decade, and looking at that history tells you something about how these episodes have typically unfolded before. Years before this war began, the U.S. sent a private diplomatic warning to Iran's supreme leader over threats to block the strait, with the Secretary of Defense at the time calling any Iranian blockade a red line the U.S. would not tolerate, and the Secretary of State delivering the same message privately. Around that same period, video captured Iranian Revolutionary Guard speedboats closing within 500 yards of a U.S. warship, ignoring whistle and voice signals. Incidents U.S. officials at the time characterized as provocative but ultimately routine posturing, rather than a genuine attempt to escalate to open conflict. A few years after that, Iran again threatened to shut the strait if what a general called the enemy made what he described as a small mistake. And around the same period, 10 American sailors were briefly detained after their patrol boats drifted into Iranian territorial waters, released within about 16 hours after a diplomatic exchange. And even more recently, before this specific war began, CENTCOM issued formal warnings to Iran ahead of live-fire naval drills in the strait, explicitly listing behaviors it would not tolerate: unsafe overflights, high-speed boat approaches on a collision course, weapons trained on U.S. vessels, while also explicitly acknowledging Iran's right to operate in international waters and airspace. Looking at that timeline together, a pattern emerges that's genuinely useful context. Nearly every one of those prior episodes involved threats, close encounters, brief detentions, or tense standoffs, but none of them involved a sustained, multi-month shooting war layered directly on top of the Strait dispute. The 2012 diplomatic warning was purely rhetorical brinkmanship. Strong language exchanged through official channels, no shots fired. The 2016 sailor detention was resolved through direct diplomacy within a single day. Even the naval drills and speedboat harassment incidents, tense as they clearly were for the sailors involved, were understood by officials at the time as calculated signaling rather than a prelude to actual combat. Every single one of those episodes eventually cooled down without the strait closing and without a prolonged war breaking out over it, which is exactly why. For over a decade, the working assumption among most officials covering this region has been that Iran's threats to close Hormuz function primarily as leverage rather than a genuine intention to follow through. Leverage precisely because everyone involved understands how catastrophic it would actually be for Iran's own economy if that leverage were ever fully cashed in. I'm walking you through that history because I think it matters for calibrating how alarmed to be about the current moment. Most officials, across more than a decade of these episodes, have consistently assessed that Iran is unlikely to permanently close the strait outright, because doing so would cripple Iran's own oil exports and alienate essentially every country in the world that depends on Middle East oil, including countries Iran depends on diplomatically and economically. That calculus hasn't obviously changed. What's different this time isn't the threat itself. It's that we're not in a standoff of threats and posturing anymore. We're in an actual ongoing shooting war, now in its 5th month, where the traditional deterrent logic that's kept the strait open through a decade of prior close calls is being tested under conditions no prior episode actually reached. Here's my honest assessment, and I want to keep it distinct from everything you just heard, the same way I do in every one of these breakdowns. I think the shipping industry's self-imposed freeze is actually a more significant near-term pressure point on both governments than the nightly strike count. Governments can absorb a strike and counter-strike cycle for a long time, especially one concentrated on military infrastructure with relatively contained casualty numbers on any given night. Global shipping companies, insurers, and the oil markets watching all of this cannot absorb an indefinitely frozen Strait of Hormuz without real, mounting economic consequences that eventually become impossible for either government to ignore, regardless of how the military situation on the ground is going. If I had to bet on what actually forces a genuine, lasting pause in this war, rather than another brief ceasefire that collapses in under 3 weeks like the last one did, I'd bet on economic pressure from exactly this kind of shipping paralysis, before I'd bet on either side simply running out of military will to continue. There's a specific reason I trust that read more than most predictions I could offer about this war. It's grounded in incentives that don't depend on either side's stated intentions actually being honest. Trump has said things that turned out to shift within days before. Iranian officials have made claims that other sources on the ground have directly contradicted, like the Al-Tamf story I walked through earlier. But global insurance markets and shipping companies don't have a political incentive to posture. They're responding to real, measurable risk with real financial consequences attached, which makes their behavior a genuinely more reliable signal of how dangerous this specific waterway actually is right now than any official statement from either government. When the ships start moving again in meaningful numbers, that's the tell that both sides have actually functionally de-escalated, regardless of what either government's spokespeople are saying in press briefings that week. On the Al-Tanf claim specifically, I'd treat it as unconfirmed until either the U.S. military directly addresses it, or further independent reporting corroborates, or further contradicts the Syrian source's denial. Claims of attacks on U.S. bases carry enormous weight if true, and enormous risk of becoming misinformation if repeated uncritically before they're verified. So I'm deliberately not treating it as settled either way in this video, and I'd encourage you to be skeptical of any content that presents it as confirmed fact in either direction right now. On the offensive phase language, I think this is worth watching closely over the coming days, specifically for whether Iran's actual strike pattern changes, rather than trusting the rhetoric alone. Wars generate plenty of maximalist language on both sides that doesn't always translate into a genuine operational shift. If Iranian strikes over the next week start hitting targets or locations that can't reasonably be framed as direct retaliation for a specific prior U.S. strike, that's the concrete signal that phrase actually meant something operationally. If the pattern stays essentially reactive, I'd read it as primarily rhetorical resolve signaling, aimed as much at an Iranian domestic audience as at Washington. I'd add one more layer to that specific read. Language like offensive phase also tends to serve an internal political function inside Iran itself, separate from anything aimed at the U.S. or international audiences. After months of absorbing sustained strikes on infrastructure, surveillance networks, and coastal defenses, framing the next stage as offensive rather than reactive gives Iran's own leadership a narrative of initiative and agency to present domestically, rather than a narrative of simply enduring repeated attacks night after night. That doesn't make the phrase meaningless. Declared shifts in posture do sometimes precede real operational changes, but it's exactly the kind of statement where the gap between what's said for a domestic audience and what actually happens operationally tends to be widest, which is one more reason I'm treating it as a signal to watch, rather than a fact to report as already true. Every video in this series so far has led with strikes, casualties, or a specific piece of hardware. I wanted this one to lead with something quieter and, I'd argue, more revealing: a waterway that's gone still. There's no dramatic footage of a frozen shipping lane the way there is of a missile launch, which is exactly why it gets undercovered relative to how much it actually matters. 140 days into an active war, the fact that an entire global industry has independently decided this specific stretch of ocean isn't worth the risk tells you something about the real, lived state of this conflict that a strike count alone never will. I also think there's a broader lesson in how this specific update came together that applies to how you should watch coverage of this war generally, from any source, including this one. The loudest claim of any given day: an attack on a U.S. base, a critical target destroyed, a dramatic new phase declared, isn't automatically the most important story of that day. And it isn't automatically true just because it's dramatic. Sometimes the actual story is quieter. An industry analyst's 6-word assessment that nobody's willing to move, or a Syrian source's on-record denial of a claim that had already started circulating as fact. Learning to weigh those against each other rather than defaulting to whichever version is more exciting is genuinely the whole difference between following this war and understanding it. If you want the next update the moment the shipping picture actually shifts, traffic resuming, the blockade tightening further, or genuine negotiations restarting, subscribe, because that's exactly the kind of quieter, easy-to-miss development I'll keep tracking alongside the louder headlines. Second, if this kind of source-by-source, claim-by-claim breakdown is what you actually want more of, hit like on this one specifically, because it tells me directly that slower, careful coverage is worth continuing to make instead of chasing whatever the loudest, unverified claim of the day happens to be. And third, tell me in the comments which thread you want followed up next. The Al-Tanf claim once more information comes out, the economics of the shipping freeze and what it actually cost per day, or the history of past Hormuz standoffs and how each of those eventually got resolved. I read every comment, and they've shaped the direction of every update in this series so far. One last thought before I let you go. If you've watched more than one of these updates by now, you've probably noticed I don't give you a tidy ending. This war doesn't have one yet, and I'm not going to manufacture false closure just to make a video feel more complete. What I can promise you is the same thing every time. I'll tell you clearly what's confirmed, what's disputed, and what I genuinely don't know, and I'll keep doing that as many nights as this war keeps generating news worth breaking down properly. Thanks for sitting through the version of this story that actually earns your trust instead of just your watch time. I'll see you in the next one.